some would say that we're putting them into a whole new atmosphere. We're taking them off this world. We're training our listeners to be astronauts. What's up, everybody? Thanks for tuning in to Off the Top Podcast. I'm your host, Julian. Jordan, how are things doing on your end?
Dude, they're awesome, man. Out of this world, some would say.
I think our listeners are in for a treat today. From a lot of the research we've done in the past, today's topic on astronauts was actually really fun to look into and see kind of how you become an astronaut and some of the effects it has on the body that I wasn't really aware of. I just kind of thought of astronauts as, I don't know, mythical creatures were right, but just people were just astronauts. And I never really thought about how they got there.
I think there was a lot of that on my end as well. And the fact of they're kind of like a little bit of a mystery. Everyone knows about them. As a kid, that's like one of the most popular things that you want to grow up and do. But in the sense of like, you know, having a real world, like, oh, this is what an accounting does and looks like. There's no, this is what an astronaut does and like looks like. So I think that this is, first off, a really good podcast for good information. And also, like you said, a fun research as well.
Yeah. And one of the things I found when first jumping into the astronaut world was that astronaut actually came from the Greek words of astro and nauts, which meant star sailor, which I don't know why we're calling them astronauts, and we should be calling them star sailors, because to me, that is such a cooler job title than astronaut. Be like, oh, what do you do? I'm just a star sailor, man. You know, just sailing the stars, doing my thing.
Yeah, that sounds way, way better. And almost sounds like some sort of Guardians of the Galaxy-esque type like role name, Star Sailor. I dig it for sure. I agree.
Yeah, and these star sailors, there's thousands of applicants, which we'll get to here shortly. And typically there's two types, right? You have military applicants and civilian applicants. And that's pretty straightforward on, you know, their background and where they're coming from. And that's the first thing that jumped out to me, is seeing that there's obviously two paths to get there, and they have, you know, kind of different qualifications that help these, you know, military or civilian applicants get to being these astronauts.
Exactly. And so you kind of have, like what Julian's saying, the dichotomy of, you know, your military experience going into it and then your civilian experience going into it. And they pull from both pools like pretty regularly or reliably when they do like have openings. And another thing that they look for too with those same pools is how educated you are, like what your degree is in, because it is a minimum to have a college bachelor degree in something. And that specifically would be in the field of like STEM, or like in basically the required like bachelor degrees could be engineering, biological science, physical science, mathematics. And then there's a few exceptions like geography or even aviation management in there that you can like, you know, get to the next level with that bachelor's degree.
And that's one of the things that I never really thought about of, you know, what type of degrees do these astronauts have? I always, once again, came back to like astronauts are just astronauts. And it makes a lot of sense being in this STEM field that's the education you need to kind of understand the job title and the job description of what you'll be doing. And that's why often that these astronauts typically have a master's or a PhD in these fields, where some of them have multiple degrees in various different STEM areas, which makes, you could imagine, that applicant field very, very qualified and probably really difficult to choose from.
Exactly. So I want to break it down in the numbers and then give you the percentages of who has what. So in 2017, it was a good year for NASA when it comes to applicants. There was about 18,300 people who applied for their 14 or fewer spots in the NASA, like in NASA's next astronaut class. And just kind of like a other record that they had before, which is amazing how much like this has grown. In about 1978, the record was 8,000 applicants. So that obviously is a huge jump in leap over what the previous record was. And out of those, basically, when they get to choose you, which we'll talk about that process too, about the 257 astronauts that have been over like the years that have gotten chosen, you'll see a chance of like 0.6 to be selected out of your application group And of course, the non-pilots and the civilians who have completed their masters have about a 38.9 chance, or that's basically the density of like what the non-civilian or civilian masters holders like are made of. And then the PhDs are really closely following that up is about 38.3%. And then the pilots selected, 52% had their master's degree and 43% only a bachelor's degree.
Yeah, and that's a great breakdown to show, I'll look at one of the bigger numbers here, and that 52% of the selected pilots have a master's degree, showing that education is valued very highly in that system. And there's some other qualifications that they look at, such as, you'll need up to 3 years of experience in that related field or related work, very similar to other jobs, but something in, this kind of astronaut and space involvement, along with, on the military side, you'll need up to 1,000 hours of pilot in command time in a jet aircraft. So there's a few different things coming to play here. And what I take away from this is, Jordan said a little over 18,000 people applied. I've never met anyone who knows anyone who applied to be an astronaut. So once again, it comes down to very, very small amount of people are applying, but that small group of people is very, very qualified to at least have an opportunity to become a candidate.
Exactly. Honestly, Julian, I thought it would be way, way bigger as far as like who doesn't want to be an astronaut. But maybe it's also the fact that, who has the requirements to be an astronaut and then who has the desire to as well. And I wanted to, before you jump in, I wanted to talk about this really interesting story because a lot of you people, I'm sure, are thinking like, shoot, like, so, the chances of me getting in with a bachelor's degree is pretty small. And I have to get a master's degree. It's better if I get a PhD. There's a lot of hurdles to jump, and we haven't even talked about the physical ones yet. But I found a really, really cool story about Clay Anderson, who was a NASA space astronaut. And basically, he wrote a book and he described his time becoming, or the application process of being an astronaut. And this guy failed 14 times before the 15th time when he was accepted as an astronaut. So, I mean, there are situations where, and NASA does encourage people to apply and apply again, just because it's such a tight window that even if you're more than qualified and can do the job, you might not be accepted. But if you have persistence, like Clay Anderson did, you can make it up there.
It's truly phenomenal to think, some of the qualifications just in education alone that these candidates need to have. For this guy being, trying 14 times to get shut down and on the 15th time get an opportunity must have been, a phenomenal feeling for him and kind of, somewhat of a relief. As think about, if you know anyone with their master's or their PhD, I find it hard to believe that someone with that level of education is getting denied 14 times before getting the job in the field they'd like to go on and, create a career out of.
Exactly. And can you imagine, like, the way that Clay's friends were and his parents were like reacting to this? Like, oh, Clay is applying again. Like, okay, like best of luck. But, what I think that's also like, a cool story on his end being like so persistent. And I feel like it kind of paints the picture. Granted, it's almost a caricature of the application process, but I think it also shows you that it's just like an insanely competitive and insanely high requirement to meet this bar as far as getting into the program. And then it just goes up from there. And Julian, I want to talk about a little bit of the physical requirements too. Tell our listeners about that stuff.
One, I'm going to say this is the part where I got slightly upset at, right? I did not know, it makes sense, but I did not know there was a selected height range you have to be in. And that is 62 inches or 5'1" to 75 inches, which is 6'2". And luckily for me, I'm right on that line at 6'2". But for my co-host Jordan, like he could have all the qualifications in the world and be outside of that height range. as one of the physical requirements that they look at while screening candidates.
Whoa, dude. All right. So you gotta, are we being real here? I read that too. And I was pretty upset. But in the instance of like, I now understand how extremely like stringent it is to be an astronaut, that I probably would fudge a little bit into the numbers to say, I'm just kind of like a really broad and burly 6'2", maybe even give them the 6'2.5", and then see if I could sneak in. But along with the height requirement, there's also like, so you have to have 20/20 vision, but that could be allowed with glasses too. So that's fine. And another thing too is that your blood pressure cannot be more than 140/90 in a sitting position, as well as being in extremely good shape and flexible.
And I think to what Jordan was saying, why this physical portion is so important to them is, one, I'm not going to begin down the rabbit hole, but the math, to send an astronaut or a star sailor into space is incredible. Those variances in 1 inch to 2 inches and the weight differences and, the different velocities and angles and calculations and everything that I don't know too much about is probably substantial when you start getting bigger astronauts, or if they're too small, or you have to, build the rocket essentially to make sure that this astronaut is going to be the right fit, and making sure that, when they go into space, their blood pressure isn't going to affect them, and that they're able to make these changes and make sure everything is in a line the way they need it to be, and be able to, move through kind of a weird weightless gravity state in a small space station.
Exactly. I think that you painted the picture really well, in the fact of, it takes a lot and there's a lot to be expected from you. I mean, not only are these people like being trained in how to work around and move in space and what like the physics are and everything like that, and how to work the space shuttle, but they also taught in things like dentistry and mechanical engineering and things of that nature. So like if you have certain things, let's say that you're either a smoker or you have like bad teeth, those things are huge risk to basically a space mission, in the fact of, if you have like an emergency root canal that you need to do and you can't operate the space station well, NASA thinks that this is probably not a good candidate, in the fact of that the jeopardy of risking this mission is much higher with this person compared to another. So that's another thing to think about when you think and consider about like, wow, these kind of requirements are pretty stringent. It's also because that there is a lot playing into the success of the mission with your team and everything like that. And another thing I want to mention too that I found is with the European Space Agency, the ESA, this isn't with NASA particularly because there is no age requirement for NASA, but the ESA basically has a preference, and I'm putting that in quotes, of people aged from 27 to 37. And so on top of all of that other NASA stuff, you also have to be lucky in the fact that, you just might be at the perfect timing. So, you happen to be 28 when the application opens, or you happen to be like 30. And if you miss that tight window because there's not a lot of time to apply, then
Some of the things that Jordan touched on there, and you apply that to what we talked to earlier about NASA's application, about 18,000 people. Realistically, when you put in all of these factors of being in great shape, having perfect vision, good blood pressure, being in a preferable age range, a height, really narrows it down even further to where there's probably realistically at any given time or any given applicant size, there's probably only 100 people who fit perfectly in there. But if you're lucky enough and you're one of those 100 people that fit perfectly in there, then you get selected. Once you get selected, you don't, go to the International Space Station right away. Typically there's, a wait time before you're put onto a mission or sent into space. You do some things in the meantime to make sure you're prepared and diligent with your work when you get the opportunity.
Exactly. I mean, there is a lot of prep time and training beforehand. And another thing, too, is we kind of talked about the education physical side, but there's also a psychological side. So if you're applying, anticipate when you get further on in the road that you will be required to take psychological tests to see like kind of personality traits and how you deal with pressure. But talking about the training that Julian was mentioning, there's some really, really interesting training. And I just want to touch on first the training that I feel like people don't really know about, but you must know Russian if you are going to be an astronaut. And the reason why is because the ISS has this almost like Russian side. So you'll have buttons that are in Russian, or, you know, only instructions in Russian, or dealing with, you know, your Russian coworkers to deal with. So that's one thing that I found like pretty interesting, is that there, you know, you don't also have to be like technologically and educationally like on point, but you also have to speak some Russian, which I found like pretty cool.
I saw that too and found it super interesting. And I also noticed that during this I want to say downtime, but this prep time, some of them become qualified scuba divers to deal with, you know, some of the different pressures. You know, some of them go on to understand kind of military survival training. They go on to being exposed to high and low atmospheric pressures. And then you get the vomit comet.
Yeah, the vomit comet's just a treat, and you do it after lunch. And no, so what the vomit comet is basically a machine that helps you simulate zero gravity conditions for like periods up to around like 20 seconds. It like does this through like almost manipulating Earth's gravity to kind of have like that really short amount of weightlessness. And another thing that you probably, you know, see a lot is kind of like the centrifuge, where the spinning machine, you know, it'll have you like spinning around in like almost like a gyroscope. And you'll also have to do like interesting little techniques in the fact of, you know, you're spinning around in this thing, and you then have to repeat the numbers back to this person that's telling you on the outside, but in reverse order. So let's say you're spinning around and I say 782. So then what you have to repeat back to me is 287. And then you go on like that. And so I find that, you know, the training is not obviously average training for anything anybody's ever done. When's the last time that you know, had to strap into the vomit comet for any reason?
Truly something else. There's no way I don't think you'd be prepared for or ready for it. Just you learn over time and prep for it. And then once you graduate, still takes years to get missions. And fun little fact here is, once you graduate and say you do get a mission, a spacesuit, an astronaut suit, costs a whopping $12 million per suit, which is the most expensive wardrobe I think I've ever heard of. But it makes sense if, you know, that's your livelihood once you get up there in your $12 million suit. But, you know, when you're not in the suit and you're waiting for your mission, they typically serve as the Capcom or the capsule communicator and mission control, and help fellow astronauts who are already out on their missions and in space and communicate with them and relay different messages to, you know, help them become a little bit more comfortable with the communication ways and, you know, what the astronauts may be feeling, may not be feeling while in space.
And it portrays that, you know, if these rappers really had it, they'd be talking about their spacesuit that they just got blinged out. One point that I want to point out, too, is the cost of the spacesuits, $12 million. The amount of pay they get per year is somewhere between, and astonishingly, I feel like people would imagine it's higher, but somewhere between about like 65,000 to 100 grand or so a year as being like an active duty astronaut. And so you think that these people getting shot into the final frontier would be getting paid a little bit, or, you think that they're like, hazard pay would go up a bit, but these people aren't getting paid hundreds and thousands of dollars. They are getting paid, like what you think an average government worker would get paid.
Yeah. Very, very surprising what they get paid, especially when you count in some of the effects that they see. In the short term, they see weightlessness. They kind of get confused of their sense of what's up and what's down, what's left and what's right. They also kind of lose track of limbs relatively, kind of, not necessarily feeling the gravity all around you. In that weightlessness, you kind of forget, where your left foot is floating to or your right hand. And then they'll move, they also face some long-term effects such as, running into calcium deficiency, muscular atrophy. And that's why you see on the space station, they try to incorporate some sort of exercise to keep some of that muscle there so that they don't dwindle down into nothing while in space. They also see, changes in eye pressure, which can affect vision. They could potentially lose their taste, which I thought was the most surprising of them all, is that you could go into space, kind of food starts tasting bland, and then boom, you don't have any taste.
And I knew that fact from the beginning. And I think it was just because, Gordon Ramsay cannot afford to go to space, because if he loses his taste, we're all screwed. So, I mean, it's just not a height requirement as well. It's a lifestyle requirement. And the fact that, these people are risking their health when they go up to space. When you're in space, obviously with zero gravity and less pressure, your body stops working as hard. Your blood your heart doesn't need to pump as hard to have the blood move around. It kind of does it on its own. Muscles obviously don't have to hold up to the pressure or the gravitational pull that Earth does. And so things start changing. And so that's why that they work out about 2 hours a day to kind of hold their muscular and body frame. So when they come back to Earth, they're not just puddles and kind of sink into the ground.
That's the other thing too, is once they come back down, after those effects and, some psychological effects of being by yourself off of Earth, isolated and having high stress to maintain your duties and performance, poor quality of sleep, it takes them months to get back to normal and, day-to-day activities after coming down from, a week in space, or some people's cases, 160 days. It takes a lot of time and careful tracking of what they're doing to make sure that they're healthy and ready to move on back to the normal day-to-day activities on Earth, including gravity.
Julian, could you imagine that your dinners consist of you, literally, you can rocket a piece of food and it'll travel across the room, and then you jump and chase that food and eat it out of midair. That obviously is way funner than what we have to do on Earth.
I think it would be a little weird to adjust back to Earth, but, I think the best way to adjust back to Earth after learning about astronauts is, browsing through the off the top podcast categories and podcasts and, seeing what's been going on through Earth, through Jordan and I.
What I really want to say is we appreciate you guys so much for, giving us feedback and listening and giving us reviews and things of that nature. Honestly, you guys are awesome. You guys are out of this world, my special stars. And, it just makes it way easier, way funner, and, way more rewarding to do this with you guys along with us in this journey.
Extremely ecstatic about your support. Maybe down the line, we'll become the first podcast from space. Speaking for mine, I don't know if Jordan wants to go into space, but, the limits are endless.
Absolutely. And I don't care how tall I am, NASA, I'm getting up there. So let it be known.
Any final words, Jordan?
This is one small step for me and Julian, but one large step for the podcasting industry. Thanks, guys. Peace.